Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, as I can now say, since it's 12:06. It looks like we're all ready to get started with the chairman's press conference. So at this point, I will turn it over to the chairman for some opening remarks and taking questions from you all. Take it away, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Pelkey. In these times of division and discord, there are still a few things that everybody can agree on. One, we are all sick and tired of robocalls. Two, we all want somebody to do something about it. And three, we all want action sooner rather than later. Well, today, the Federal Communications Commission voted to give Americans who are fed up with robocalls the relief they want and deserve. As a result of today's vote, we hope and expect to see progress on multiple fronts in the war against robocalls. Most notably, we have cleared the path for a dramatic expansion of call blocking technologies so that a phone call can be stopped before it even gets to your phone. Currently, you have to affirmatively reach out to your carrier to activate these services. With today's vote, phone companies will have the legal clarity they need in order to offer call blocking services as a default. Think for a moment about how many junk mails you used to get before spam filters. We hope that call blocking default can have a similar impact in reducing unwanted robocalls. We also took a step to ensure that robust caller ID authentication is implemented in order to combat spoofed robocalls. With today's vote, the FCC is essentially heeding President Reagan's famous advice and adopting a trust but verify approach to call authentication. I applaud the progress carriers have made in recent months towards implementing the Shake and Stir framework, and am optimistic that the end of the year deadline will be met. But to make sure that that happens, we've begun laying the groundwork so we can proceed directly to final rules if industry does not get the job done. Now, earlier I said that everybody wants to crack down on unwanted robocalls. That's not entirely accurate. Many robocallers, including debt collectors, oppose what we are doing and asked us to delay our vote today. With all due respect, today was not the time for delay and stalling tactics. It was a time for action. Consumers have had it with unwanted robocalls, and the Commission just moved to provide them with relief as soon as possible. With that, I would be happy to take your questions.
Take it away.
Chairman Matt Daneman, Communications Daily. First, my condolences on being a Michigan fan.
To be clear, I was not taking a position. I was just throwing out, as we gave to some Ohio State fans, we wanted to throw a bone to our Michigan friends as well.
It seemed clear to me. I'm asking philosophically, not about any specific proceeding. I'm asking a philosophical question, so caveat with that. Do you see First Amendment issues and the proliferation of video distribution methods raising questions about the existence of other media rules regarding carriage of particular content? Commissioner Starks had sort of raised that red flag a little bit. I'm curious, from a philosophical standpoint, again, not asking about any ongoing proceeding that you cannot talk about, where do you think this sits philosophically?
I would certainly extend to you my heartfelt congratulations on an attempt. But what I would say is that in this context, I would limit my comments on the constitutional concerns to the proceeding in which they were raised, which is the least activist regime. And that's the context in which the First Amendment questions were squarely presented. And I wouldn't read more into my comments than I offered this morning.
Touche.
Hi, Chairman. Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. I have a two-part question about the call blocking order.
Okay.
First of all, I'm wondering if you can talk about what you plan to do next. I think you sort of alluded to that on the robocall front. And I was wondering if you can comment specifically on a situation that some commenters raised on the record where institutions that generate a high volume of calls, like a jail, might get blocked. What do you think will happen in that instance, and do you think that the order adequately protects against that?
Sure. So with respect to the second part of the question, what do we plan to do next? We'll be monitoring the adoption and implementation of the Shake and Stir framework. On July 11th, as you might have seen, we'll be hosting a summit in this very room, I would expect, in which we will seek the information from the carriers about where they stand in terms of the implementation of that framework. We'll, of course, continue to working with outside stakeholders. Recently, Addis, for example, as you might have seen, appointed iConnective as the administrator, which is a key step in in advancing this framework forward. And so in terms of the regulatory steps we'll take, I think it's going to be a continuation of our efforts thus far. On the enforcement side as well, we, of course, continue to pursue aggressive enforcement action against those who are bombarding American consumers with these robocalls. And while I can't forecast a specific month or a specific enforcement action, what I can tell you is that our Enforcement Bureau has been doing terrific work trying to track down, in consultation in some cases with the private sector, which has a traceback effort, some of these robocallers who are violating our rules potentially.
Hi, Alex Wiltz with Reorg M&A. Given that you and 2 other Republican commissioners have said you either support or inclined to support conditional approval of the Sprint and T-Mobile deal, I was just wondering when you expect to wrap up the proceeding and issue a proposed order.
I can't give you a time frame on when we expect to wrap up the proceeding, but what I can say is that we expect to circulate an order to the commissioners in the coming weeks.
Hi, Chairman. I'm Kristen Wright with Cox Media Group. And I'm wondering regarding the call blocking, whether you have a position on whether providers should charge fees for that service.
We expect that these call blocking services by default will be offered for free. These services by being offered by default would actually reduce the cost for the phone companies. Currently, they have all of these robocalls going over their networks. The handling of those calls generates costs, and in addition, the handling of consumer complaints that result from those robocalls can get expensive. For example, in the record, there is, in our order rather, there is a suggestion that the handling of a single consumer complaint about a robocall can cost a carrier $10. And so going forward, our expectation is certainly that those services would be offered for free, as many call blocking services today are offered for free. But one of the reasons why I was grateful for Commissioner Stark's input is that we made clear if they aren't within a certain period of time, a year in particular, we'll take a look and determine whether or not, based on public input, a rule requiring them to be offered for free would be appropriate. Oh, that reminds me, by the way, I missed Ms. Griffith's second question, which was about essentially the legitimate callers, and that's one of the reasons why I think it was important, based in part from input from Commissioner O'Reilly, to set up a mechanism where a legitimate caller could register a complaint with the requisite provider, and then have that complaint resolved. And so that's something I'm grateful to him for highlighting.
Thank you.
Okay, Howard Busker, Communications Daily. I just had just not really a two-part questions, but I just wanted to ask you about 2 things, both mid-band related.
Okay.
One is there was a delay on dealing with 5.9, and but I think that was supposed to be maybe a month delay. So is that going to be ready maybe for the next meeting? And then also I wanted to, I know you don't like to scoop yourself before your blog, but I wanted to ask about that.
Yeah.
And then also there's been a lot of pressure on Legato, and then they're complaining that they're sort of in a difficult financial situation and need some more certainty from the FCC. So just those 2 mid-band things.
Sure. On the first, as I mentioned at the time, I spoke with Secretary Chow at the Department of Transportation, and she requested additional time to review the appropriate steps forward that the FCC was considering with respect to the 5.9 gigahertz band. And as a matter of comedy with our sister agency, we accommodated that request. I can't forecast what's going to be on the July agenda, but I can tell you that there will be a scintillating blog post that will come out 3 weeks before July 6th that I would commend to your attention, where we will outline the exciting array of items that the Commission will be voting on. The second one is Legato. I don't have anything in particular other than the 5 megahertz notice of proposed rulemaking that the Commission adopted recently. We're looking at the remainder of the company's request and working with other stakeholders to determine the appropriate way forward.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Monica Hogan with Communications Daily.
Hi.
What can you tell me about the Commission's plans to use broadband mapping systems to help the administration with the opioid crisis?
Sorry, with the...
With the opioid crisis?
Yeah, so this is one of the issues that we've been thinking about, is how broadband mapping, or broadband availability, generally speaking, can intersect with some of these public health or public safety issues. One of them, of course, involves our memorandum of understanding with the National Cancer Institute to track cancer rates in Appalachia, but another one involves the opioid crisis. And I've had the chance to work with a variety of different stakeholders, from the Veterans Affairs Department to state and local officials and consumer groups around the country, to try to figure out, is there a way that we can promote more broadband connectivity in some of these areas that have been hit hard by the opioid crisis in order to provide more information to would-be patients or people who are suffering from addiction. In addition, broadening the scope of telemedicine. One of the things that I've noticed a lot in my travels around the country to now 45 states and the territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands is that there are many parts of the country where you will not find a single doctor resident in those towns. And if you're somebody who's suffering from addiction, and especially if you have an emergency relating to that addiction, it's not enough to be able to say, well, you can drive 3 hours west or east or north or south to find a provider. And so our hope is that telehealth and telemedicine solutions could be very valuable in closing that gap. And so we're very optimistic that we can expand on that initiative in the time to come. And I think, as I've said before many times, in collaboration with the former Chairman Newt Minow, this represents a tremendous opportunity to make the lives of the American people longer and healthier and better. And I think the opioid crisis screams out for that kind of solution.
Thank you.
Nothing for me, thanks.
Anyone? Dave, you want to go?
I mean, I pandered to you on the Wolverines. You got to, yeah. So.
You can go first.
Hey, this year is another chance, huh? Two-part question, a couple long-running issues where there have been some significant developments. First, on China and the USF proceeding. As you know, President Trump signed an executive order recently to protect the supply chain. How does that executive order affect the timing of your bringing the USF order for final approval? As well as you probably know, Congress is now considering legislation to give rural carriers as much as $700 million to remove the Huawei equipment from their networks. Do you need to wait for Congress to act? And then secondly, on Sprint T-Mobile, this is the first time we've had a chance to ask you about it. How important is it that the Boost Mobile sale ensure an effective new competitor in the market? And are you waiting for that divestiture to take place before you circulate the order?
Okay, so as I understand it, a two-part question with three actual questions. The first one is, no, just as a technical matter, I'm trying to be accurate here. So the first one, as I understand it, is how the President's executive order affects our supply chain proceeding. What I can tell you there is I, in consultation with our General Counsel's office, am looking at what the effect of the executive order would have on that proceeding, and that review is ongoing. The second one was with respect to Congress, which is considering legislation to extend to some of the rural carriers that might have incorporated into their networks problematic equipment, funding to get rid of that equipment. That is an initiative that I generally support and would be happy to provide technical assistance on should Congress find it appropriate. It doesn't necessarily affect us directly to the extent that we obviously Congress would be the one to make the decision in the first instance about funding. With respect to the third question, one of the reasons why we thought that condition with respect to the Boost divestiture was in the public interest was that it addressed one of the potential concerns that had been identified in the record with respect to the effect of the consummation of the transaction on the prepaid market. And so that divestiture condition, as it is structured, we believe would indeed address that concern.
Hi, Ryan Tracy with the Wall Street Journal.
Hi.
I'd like to follow up on the sort of what's next with combating robocalls question. You answered with respect to what's next from the perspective of the regulator, but can you broaden that a little bit? I mean, the people that read our stories today want to know when the calls will stop. And so, based on everything you know about this issue, what now needs to happen beyond what happened today for that to happen?
So from our perspective, at least, we believe that we have now clarified the legal foundation for call blocking services by default to be more broadly developed and deployed. And our hope and expectation is that phone companies will take advantage of that legal clarity and move very quickly to deploy these services. It is not just a burden on consumers, it's also a burden on the companies themselves, because as I pointed out, all of these billions of robocalls traverse these companies' networks. They clog up the networks. They require customer care centers to deal with the complaints that are generated as a result of them. And so I think it's a burden on everybody in the entire phone system. And that's one of the things we hope they will adopt quickly. Additionally, we expect them to continue the progress on the development and implementation for each individual major carrier on Shake and Stir. And that's one of the reasons why I'm looking forward to our summit on July 11th is to essentially have a mid-year progress report for 2019 on where they stand on implementation of that framework. And that's going to be useful because, as I pointed out, in collaboration with as other commissioners here today, we set the necessary steps in motion with our order today so that if we need to move forward with rules requiring the implementation of the Shake and Stir framework, we'll be in a position to do that. But I am pleased with the progress that has been made so far. I, of course, encourage the major carriers to continue that progress so that we meet that end-of-the-year deadline. And from my perspective, whether it is someone emailing me from out in the hinterlands or my own mom, I want them to know that the relief is on the way. We expect this robocall blocking by default solution to be a significant dent in the problem, and we'll continue taking all of the other steps necessary to give Americans the peace of mind that the phone is once again going to be their friend as opposed to their enemy.
John Reed, Bloomberg Law. As you know, NOAA and some members of Congress have raised concerns about the 24 gigahertz auction. And
So I hear, yes.
Yeah. Do you think that could slow down the process to getting the spectrum into the hands of carriers, or will it have no effect at all?
What I will say is that the FCC, when I introduced the 5G fast plan last year, set a marker, and we wanted to promote American leadership in 5G, not just because we do compete with other countries in the development of these technologies, but because we firmly believe that the development and deployment of 5G technologies and services in this country will have a massive effect, a positive effect on job creation, on economic growth, on innovation and entrepreneurship, all to the benefit of American consumers. And we've been consistently executing on that strategy, the first plank of which, of course, is getting more spectrum into the commercial marketplace. We've just completed our second millimeter wave auction, the 24 gigahertz auction. We'll be looking to auction further bands later this year. And we believe that the protection limits and other steps we have outlined over the past couple of years protect all of the services that require this spectrum, not just the 5G services that we expect to be deployed, but also the passive weather sensors and other important services. And so I think it's a false juxtaposition to say that we either have 5G or passive weather sensing or other important services. We can have both. And our approach is going to consistently be informed not by the politics of the day or anything of the sort, but rather science and good engineering. And that ultimately, I think, is what is going to deliver American success in 5G and preserve the important weather forecasting and other functions that this spectrum enables. Okay, thanks everybody.
At this point, my colleague Mark Wigfield will come up for the Bureau press conference. Thanks, everyone.
Good afternoon. So the first item would be the robocall item. Are there questions on, yes, there are questions on robocalls. How are you? Good.
It's a big crowd.
All right, go ahead, Howard.
It's good, I just want to say it's good to see you throwing all these resources at this issue. So.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask. We know about the some of the changes that were in this. We know that the chairman had circulated the the thing on a potential mandate for shake and stir, for example. Are there other changes that you can note? I know it might be a couple. My guess is it might be a little while to get this out. But what are are there other more substantial changes over the draft that we should highlight?
With regards to getting it out?
The declaratory order and then also the FNPR. I mean, are there any other changes that you that are pretty important for people to know about? I guess is the question.
I think with regards to the speed with which the commission is looking to get it out, I think all commissioners voted for the item. I think they're ready to move it as soon as they can so that it can start the benefits for consumers. So I don't anticipate this would take long for the commission to release this item. There were a fair amount of changes to the further notice section as you highlighted with regards to shake and stir implementation by the major carriers this year, and questions about whether we should require mandate shake and stir implementation if the major carriers don't do it by the end of the year. There was also some language added regarding the reports that CGB will be required to do, directed to do by the commission at 12 and 24 months based on deployment and implementation of both call blocking technologies and shaken and stir as well.
Okay.
Anything else on this one? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The next item is leased access, so the questions have met, okay. The Media Bureau could come up.
Just the perfunctory, any changes from the draft item to what was approved today? Anything of note, difference in what the commissioners just approved from?
Nothing significant. We added some text to address an ex parte that was filed in the record, but other than that, no substantive changes.
Which ex parte, please?
Small Business Network.
Okay, but, okay. The language that was added for that, anything of no change to the actual order itself? It
No.
just addressed, okay. Cool, thank you.
Can we fairly construe this as a much smaller item than the robocall item, based on the staff response?
For us, it's a big deal.
That's the right answer.
Finally, aviation radio services. Are there questions on that item? Aviation radio services. Okay, thank you very much. And I believe the commissioners are here.
Hello, everyone. How are you today?
Good afternoon.
Can we answer any questions you may have? We'll start this way.
Commissioner O'Reilly, actually, a question directly for you.
All right.
On the least access item, you said that the finding of over-the-top is a substitute for video, traditional video distribution, and that it might inform other media actions going forward. Do you have particular media items in mind when you say that? Are there things on your wish or to-do list, or wouldn't it be nice list when you say that?
I'm contemplating a lot of things. I'm not prepared to announce anything at this moment, but I've been talking about the broader need to incorporate over the top in a lot of different settings. I've talked about it as it relates to how it's treated as part of media ownership. I've talked about it as it relates to how DOJ treats it as part of its examination of advertising. And so I think there are a number of proceedings where this is going to be important. I've also given speeches and said, you know, Title VI in my mind is where I would spend time if I were giving advice to Congress on a rewrite. I think Title VI is the most ripe area that is out of date comparably to other portions. And I think that the marketplace analysis and the suggestion of what's happening and over the top is very informative for where we should go from there.
And Commissioner Carr, I guess sort of a modification of the same question to you. You staked out your point on the First Amendment very clearly. Do you see, as Commissioner Starks did, I guess ripple effects, how this could be come to play with other sort of media-related items, and what items do you think?
Yeah, I think you start obviously from a point of first principles, which is when you look at the Supreme Court precedent, when you look at the DC Circuit, they're very clear that our rules in this space implicate First Amendment interests, that whenever you go through the process then of updating, of modifying, of reviewing, you have to run the First Amendment analysis. And that's tied, among other things, to the interest asserted by the government in infringing on that speech. Here in least access, it was about promoting this idea of a diversity of sources of information being able to be delivered to the American public. In other contexts that we touch on speech regulation, there are different asserted interests. And so I think when any of those come before us, my view is the same with obviously the Supreme Court, which is we have to run the First Amendment analysis, and how that analysis kicks out will depend on what's before us in the record at the time. So I'm certainly comfortable expressing my views on this issue, and if other ones come before us, I'll run the First Amendment analysis and see where it comes out.
But there aren't specific items that you're thinking of where, oh, the First Amendment analysis, as I'm thinking about it, I'm meeting you, this raises some problematic issues.
Well, I think a lot of areas raise First Amendment concerns, and again, that's why my point here is simply we've got to run through the First Amendment analysis. And I think it's dangerous to assert the proposition that the First Amendment effectively as a sword given to the government to try to level the playing field of ideas. The First Amendment operates as a restraint on the government. And so whenever we look at any of these rules, I'm going to run it through the First Amendment analysis and see where it comes out, but I haven't made a decision one way or the other on rules that aren't before us right now.
Thank you both very much.
But to your point, though, we have run into this in other settings. We ask questions as part of children's television modernization effort that I'm working on, and there wasn't, we specifically, looked to expose and what the implications would be, especially since the market has changed considerably. There wasn't extensive comments in the record. There were some people did comment on it, and we're going to have to see where to go based on that. But it is something that I believe is relevant to all our proceedings. And Commissioner Starks raised a number of different proceedings, and I think they're all relevant for asking those questions. It's much different than 1991 and 1992 when we had the Cable Act, or even the 96 Act.
Hi, Commissioners. Commissioner O'Reilly, my question is mostly for you. I was wondering if you could clarify your dissent or your partial dissent on the robocall item. Was it that you thought Commissioner Starks added language about the reporting requirements could be interpreted to the detriment of carriers?
Not to the detriment of carriers. I think it gave, as I read it and it was presented, is extensive authority to the Bureau to examine whatever they see fit. And I think that's problematic. I've had problems with delegation for multiple years now, and I don't think we should delegate that authority. I wanted to direct the staff to do certain more targeted issues. If they needed more authority, they can come back to the commission and seek the chairman's clarification on what that may be. But I don't like giving the authority to say, good luck, tell us where you want to go, and then let them just do whatever they want. We've had problems with that. That's how the past commissions have worked. They now rest with the fact that 90% of, I think it was 9 out of 10 decisions are done at the Bureau level, and we never see them. And I think that's problematic. And I think there's an effort that I've led, which is trying to understand what has already been delegated and put a curtail some of that effort, that we understand exactly what we're asking of staff and what we're not asking of staff. And here I thought it was too broad, and I dissented accordingly.
As a follow-up on your thoughts on this item, are you happy with where it landed as far as, I guess, making sure that wanted calls and legal calls don't get caught up in that dragnet?
Well, I think I voted for it, so I'm supportive of the item. I did raise some concerns. I have some worries that it could go in either two ways, right? Depends on the provider, depends on the analytics the software that is used. It can go in a very positive direction and be very beneficial. It could go in a troubling direction, and I just don't know yet. And so I think it's worthy of getting this out in the marketplace, and a number of providers already do this. They've had success. There are things that I was seeking. If you heard my statement, I was seeking, what is a reasoned analytics? What is that? And just trying to understand, could you have failure rates that were, 60, 70, 80%? And so I'm hopeful that we don't get in that place, that it doesn't go in that place, and I trust the chairman's on top of it. So I was happy to vote for it.
Thank you.
Hi, my question's for Commissioner O'Reilly. You've said that you're inclined to support the Sprint T-Mobile deal, but you have some issues with the conditions. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, and if there's been if you have any update on your thoughts.
Two things. One is I never comment about mergers or pending mergers or prospective mergers. In this case, I felt that it was necessary. There was both commentary happening in town and a specific story that was being written that articulating my views, which were premature. So I thought it was necessary to comment. I think that I'd only say to your point, I think I said, I didn't make critique of the conditions. I said I was examining them. I hadn't been convinced of them yet, and I'm still doing that examination. I'm waiting the document actually, and the matchup. And that's why I said I can, incline to support, and I'm waiting for the document to read through and understand all the arguments, all the data. They've been working on this. Staff's been working on this for quite a while, and I do my due diligence. I've done all the meetings that anyone's have asked for me to ex partes, and so I look forward to matching up the document and then at the appropriate time casting a vote as I deem appropriate.
Okay, Howard Busker, Communications Daily. First, a question for both of you on Eddie, do you have any thoughts on, there's been a lot of, I don't know, maybe just because we wrote a story for today, but Legato seems like it's in the news these days, and so that was a joke, but
There's always one legato question.
I think the idea that Legato's making the argument, you got to move that they're starting to run out of money, and that it's concerning, and it's been before the commission it's been there for a long time now. So, do you have any thoughts on Legato, and maybe is that a way to maybe get some mid-band spectrum into the market relatively quickly?
I haven't met personally with Legato in I think a long time at this point, so I don't have insights into where the chairman, for instance, is or is not in that proceeding, and haven't worked through the issues myself. Obviously, we're working on a lot of different fronts to push more mid-band spectrum out there, and so if that's an opportunity to do that here, that's to the benefit, but haven't fully worked through the issues there yet.
I would say I had an opportunity to meet with representatives of Legato a number of years ago, probably this month, like 2 or 3 years ago. I believe everyone's due an answer as quickly as possible. And so I'm troubled that we, I don't blame the chairman. These are some very complex issues that involve not just the FCC, but also other federal agencies. It relates to license modification. It's not something that can be simply done. So I'm disappointed. I told them at the time I don't have the capacity when they were up here to lead the effort and follow it on a daily basis. And so I just haven't. To your point in terms of is it ripe, we have an NPRM as it relates to the 5 megahertz, and so we'll have to flush that out before we can do that portion of it in any respect, in my opinion. But in terms of your last point, if I heard it correctly, is it a possibility for a mid-band play? Yeah, it's a possibility. We'll just have to see, if all the other pieces can fall into line. I don't have any more commentary than that.
Okay, and I just wanted to also ask about TCPA, and that sort of seems like it's the other side of the coin here. Is there's still all these
to Legato?
No, not to Legato. To the robocalling item, the big item of the day. I'm sorry. I don't think it has anything to do with Legato, but maybe I can look for an angle if you want to suggest that. I just wanted to ask about that's been pretty. I think a lot of people in industry thought that there would be more action on that earlier than there has been. And you talked about it a little bit earlier this week, Commissioner Riley, but I just wanted to ask both of you about that in the context of today's item.
I'm in favor of deciding those issues that have been remanded by the court and addressing the failures of the past commission and decisions that were deeply flawed. And so I think it's imperative on the commission, and have talked about that, to decide those issues. The chairman decides the timing of everything, and he's got a lot of things going on right now, so I haven't pushed beyond what I think is appropriate. I think that if we're not able to get to the remand portion, we certainly should get to the number of petitions that have been put before the commission for clarification, where companies have been, or associations have been, may be, or are seeking decisions beforehand, or are in litigation right now and trying to get the commission to clarify for purposes of getting out of the morass and litigation mess that they're stuck in. And so I'm in favor of, if we're not going to decide the bigger issue, that we do the petitions, many of the petitions. I think I want to say the number is somewhere in the low 30s, and I think we can decide on a number of those I'm in favor of, and talked about them at my speech at ACA.
Commissioner Carr, did you have any thoughts on that?
No, nothing to add. I'm happy to move forward when they're brought before us to vote, but I don't have any insight on the timing.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Monica Hogan with Communications Daily.
Welcome.
Thank you. And regarding the robocall matter, can you talk a little bit about what due process looks like for the robocallers that believe they're caught up in erroneous call blocking? What does it look like? How long should it take? That kind of thing.
What worked with the chairman's staff tonight. I don't want to be premature in commenting. The document will be available when it's ready. But we worked on trying to flush that out and give those that were erroneously being blocked an opportunity to reach to the carrier or provider that is doing the blocking and push them to have some mechanism in place, and separately have a mechanism that they can petition the commission for action. And so I think those are the two pieces that I think will be very helpful, and I appreciate the chairman's support in adding them to the item. I think it makes it a stronger item. It's one of the many issues that I had.
Thank you. Do you have anything?
Anyone from the expensive seat? I mean,
The low seats.
do they, when you go to the movie theater and you put your feet up, right? You put your, do you want a coaster or do you, cup holder?
Commissioner Carr, can I just ask on Sprint Timo, do you still have any concerns with anything you want to see in the final order in terms of either the Boost Mobile divestiture, or do you have any remaining questions before you see the actual paper?
No, I'm waiting to see the document when the chairman circulates it. As I said publicly, I'm comfortable with the decision to approve the transaction. I think the commitments that were put forward, particularly for me in terms of accelerating the build out of 5G, the commitment to get 5G to 99% of the country would notch a real good win. That's parts of the country in particular that are tough to solve, and we're working on a lot of fronts to do that, whether it's the spectrum front, whether it's making it easier to build out infrastructure, some of our universal service approaches. I think this would be another good win to make sure 5G is built out, in every part of the country, and that's a big driver for my decision on this one.
Any other questions? John Donnelly? Nope. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good lunch.
Thank you.
All right. Sounds like the party's outside, right? Oh, there it is. All right, let's get started.
Yeah, no, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I sense distance between the minority members with your standing way over there.
Oh, there's nothing metaphorical about it, don't worry.
Do it, it's reported. I guess I'm curious for both of you. Commissioner Starks, you brought this up somewhat during the least access proceeding, but are there particular media rules that you see that might be more threatened by the sort of the First Amendment stance that the majority commissioners have been staking out?
Yes, and so as I outlined in my statement, in particular, there are no doubt First Amendment issues that are raised by our cable, requiring them to carry certain channels and whatnot. The constitutional reasoning and analysis offered by the majority, the point that I'm trying to make, extends very far, has far-reaching effects, will reach very important programs such as children's TV, kid TV, which is a very hot topic, public educational government channels, PEG, which is also something that is very important. And the constitutional reasoning that they apply is going to have sweeping effects. And I think that they need to stop and think rather than just saying the fact that the internet has changed everything means our whole First Amendment analysis is going to have to be rethought through vis-a-vis cable.
I agree with everything my colleague just said. Moreover, I think my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are confused. The most important precedent when it comes to distributors are the Turner 1 and Turner 2 cases from 1994 and 1997, which applied intermediate scrutiny to these questions of First Amendment jurisprudence. Intermediate scrutiny means we ask if it is a content-neutral effort to further an important government interest and if it is narrowly tailored. Our least access rules have met that test for years. I do not understand why my colleagues don't seem to understand just that, but that's what the outstanding Supreme Court precedent says. And if we choose to try to apply it differently, not only is that not what cases have suggested, it does create vulnerabilities going forward for things like children's television and even our must-carry regime. I think that everyone needs to study the relevant Supreme Court precedent a little more, because the First Amendment, in the end, is not just about the speaking opportunities for corporations. It's about how do we effectuate more diverse speech for all of us.
Thank you both.
Great. Hi, Commissioner. Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. Commissioner Rosenworcel, I wanted to ask you whether Commissioner Stark's language for reporting in the robocall item necessarily affected your perspective on whether or not the item will mean that consumers will be charged for carriers blocking tools.
Well, for starters, I really appreciate his efforts to make sure that we have a report and we study how this blocking technology will really work in the marketplace. You know, will it reduce calls? Will it capture the right calls? And in particular, we insisted that report feature some study of what it did for 911 and public safety calls. So I think that's a terrific effort, and I supported his effort to do so. But I believe, right here, right now, consumers should not have to pay to stop this annoying increase in robocalls. This agency made some far-reaching decisions about where blocking technology can be used in our networks. We shouldn't just do that for carriers' benefit. We should do it for consumer benefit. They're fed up. I'm fed up. I shouldn't have to pay for the privilege to get this nonsense off the line.
And I supported Commissioner Rosenworcel on her edits in particular with regard to free to the document. You know, where I ended up landing is that, you know, first of all, I think we did a lot of good today. I think we will help curb robocalls here. This is not a cure-all. But the thing that I would emphasize is the language is very clear that we expect that these call blocking services are going to be free. And even on Commissioner Rosenworcel's dissent on that issue, you now have 5 commissioners who basically, 4 of us are saying the language that we have here, we expect it to be free, and a 5th commissioner who's saying, I believe even more deeply that it has to be free. And I didn't see what I wanted to see here. So when you have that many commissioners speak on something, I think the carriers are going to listen. Is the first point that I would raise. The second point that I would raise is that I'm personally going to reach out to the carriers to reemphasize to them my expectation that it be provided free. And then the third thing that I would say is the report that Commissioner Rosenworcel mentioned, which is something that I negotiated with the chairman, I think provides a mechanism whereby that is specifically going to look at these call blocking services, whether they're being charged for consumers, whether it will be free. And if it's not being free, rulemaking is going to take place.
I think it was Ronald Reagan who said, trust but verify. So while I'd like to trust that consumers are not going to get some premium charged to them on their bills for this new network technology, the only way to verify it is to require it. I think we should be doing that today, full stop.
Thank you.
Okay, in an attempt to play to the mass audience that's probably watching this show in parts of
10
rural
people, maybe a
America,
dozen.
I wanted to start out by asking about OTARD, which
We'll say over-the-air reception devices.
right. I mean,
for
but
the
OTARD is such a
two
it's
people who are
it's
not
such a
familiar with
lovely.
the
It was a
acronym.
very well. And the FCC does design these lovely acronyms, and I think OTAR is especially lovely. So I just wanted to compliment everybody here on that. But you know, the
I don't
comments.
think we can take credit. It predates us.
There were comments came in on that. You know, we're starting to see feedback on that, and there's a lot of concern in, you know, because a lot of the local governments and that kind of thing were already concerned about the work of BTAC, et cetera, and I was impressed by sort of the reaction this week that there was. So I mean, is that something that is raising red flags for you all? I know that this process is still ongoing with over-the-air devices.
Sure. I certainly am intrigued by using our OTARD rules in a more creative way to create market-based competition for the deployment of network-dense facilities that we're going to need to get out there for 5G. And I'm looking forward to reading the record. I know that is big and vast, so I'm going to have to spend a little more time with it before reaching any kind of bottom lines.
Same for me. We'll look forward to reviewing the record on that item in particular.
And then the other thing I wanted to ask about is, because I don't think I've ever asked either one of you about this, and I don't have I don't have an acronym here, but, there's a lot of focus right now on bidirectional sharing, and, this idea that maybe in places in rural America where the carriers aren't using the spectrum, that, for example, DoD might be able to use it do you have any thoughts on whether do you see the U.S. moving toward that kind of solution down the road of more bidirectional sharing?
There's obviously growing support with it, and I believe some reports came out from the administration last week pointing out the value of bidirectional sharing. I think really going forward, the most important thing is our work on the 3.5 gigahertz band, because that's a band where we are going to prove that military radar can coexist with commercial and unlicensed services. And if we prove that positively, I think we're going to have more discussion about sharing, and we'll see if it heads in both directions. But I think the most important thing is deployment in the 3.5 gigahertz band for the continuing viability of that discussion.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Monica Hogan from Communications Daily. Can you expand a little bit on your concerns regarding the recent NPRM and an overall USF budget cap? And as a second question, are there any additional conditions you would see placed on a T-Mobile Sprint merger if you were to
Okay,
vote?
two different questions, so
Yeah.
let's try. The
Okay.
first question, I did not support that rulemaking. Here's why. We have a statutory duty, a duty under the law to preserve and advance universal service. Congress was very specific about how to go and do it. Putting on a cap on that is at odds with what the law commands us to do. Moreover, the recommendation in that item is that we should cut short our efforts to deploy broadband in rural areas. We should stop our efforts to get broadband to schools. We could halt the work we do to make sure that rural telemedicine is available. And worse, we could wind up making school children who want internet access fight with rural healthcare providers to get support. As I've said before, and I'll say again, I do not support the universal service Hunger Games. I think that effort should stop right here and right now.
On the second question, I have no comment. On the first question, Commissioner Rosenworcel and I are in identical lockstep on that. I also dissented on that item. I think it is not taking us in the right direction. In particular, one of the suggestions was tying rural health care with our E-rate program. Rural health care is a program that we just bumped up our cap from $400 million to $571 million. We just voted separately on another item to blow through a $200 million subcap in rural health care. That's clearly a program that is growing. To tether the two of those would mean we'd end up eating into, I agree, we'd end up eating into school kids, I think, if we aren't thoughtful about that. I fundamentally disagreed with that approach.
And on your second question, though, I like my colleague, we're not going to get to the underlying discussion. I do want to acknowledge that in my time at the agency, I have never seen a transaction dealt with like this. My colleagues have all publicly voted on a transaction that we have absolutely no paper, analysis, or material in front of us. That just taps into the worst images of backroom dealing in Washington. I don't think it's appropriate that this is how we chose to do it. I think that we should make decisions on the basis of analysis and paper and detail and study before us, not just some announcement by press release that gets an amen chorus from some portion of this agency. There's something odd about how this all happened, and I just want to say as a procedural matter, it makes me uncomfortable.
Just to clarify, you, by publicly voted, you mean that they've expressed an opinion? but
Precisely,
there
yes.
hasn't been actual
Yeah.
voting yet, right?
Dave Shermanson from Reuters. In the aftermath of the supply chain executive order that was released last month, what steps do you think the FCC should take? Should you wait for Congress to appropriate money to rip out that equipment from the rural networks? And should the FCC advance the proceeding on the USF fund separately, or rather than wait for some
you want to go ahead?
Yes, thanks for the question. So in particular, in the executive order, it outlines 150 days for the Commerce Secretary to basically figure out what is the list. I know I certainly seems like it makes sense for our supply chain NPRM. We need to probably hold off until we hear from the Commerce Secretary on that. So I do think there is going to be some additional coordination needed. With regard to the NDAA also outlines that we need to not spend money on Chinese equipment that is otherwise prohibited. So there are a couple different touchstones that we have there. In particular, what I have started to focus on is looking at also where we know that there is Huawei equipment in particular already in our networks. That presents the identical security threats that we're talking about on a lot of these issues that we're looking at prospectively. And so in figuring out the scope of that, I think, is going to be important. Figuring out exactly what equipment we want to make sure is remediated, I think, is going to be important. And so I've written about this in The Hill about a week ago, and I'm thinking through a find it, fix it, and fund it type of programming, because I think it's going to be important that we make sure that this national security issue is handled as expeditiously as possible.
There are two things here that I think are important. The first is we should be consistent, whether it involves universal service, the Department of Commerce, the National Defense Authorization Act. We should be consistent across the board in our approach to supply chain risk. That's why I've called for the FCC to be a part of the ongoing Department of Homeland Security task force that's designed to address this problem. Lots of agencies and authorities across the government participate in that task force. It's a glaring omission that the FCC does not. And second, and this just might be a hope, but I sincerely hope for all the effort we're doing to improve information security, we will not find ourselves undermined by ongoing tariff and trade negotiations.
Hi, for Commissioner Rosenworcel. You said that the Republicans have voted the merger. I know that's colloquial, but
Yeah,
how do you count the votes? We've got Mr. Pai supported it. That's
Yeah.
pretty clear. And
You're
Mr.
correct. That is colloquial, but they have made public sentiments
Right.
that are strong and clear.
Strong and clear. Mr. O'Reilly says inclined to support. How do you
Sure.
take that? As a yes?
I take him at his word that he's inclined to support. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but
And what happened with this deal? It's something odd. Can you give us any more? What do you know about it?
no, by odd, I mean just inconsistent with historic practice where this agency coordinates closely with the Department of Justice, where the two entities with reviewing responsibility come out at the same time and articulate their theories of concern, their theories of benefit. That does not appear to be happening. The fact that neither my colleague nor I have any paper analysis or a decision before us is unprecedented. But nonetheless, we have colleagues who have voiced some form of support for a decision we don't even have before us. I just meant that's procedurally irregular.
Can you give us any insight into the Justice Department's proceedings
No,
right now?
I got to tell you, I'm not the person to look to for that.
Nor am I.
Yeah, all right.
I have a question for Commissioner Rosenworcel. I enjoyed hearing you speak last week at Stanford about your concern with giving ISPs the ability to block certain things at their discretion. I'm just wondering if you see any possibility that giving voice service providers somewhat similar power to block certain calls based on their own judgment could potentially raise new concerns.
Absolutely something to monitor. In this case, though, we are in the business of trying to figure out known fraudsters spoofing numbers and sending illegal junk over the line. It is a net public benefit for us to figure out how to prevent that all from coming into our homes. So this is something to watch, but I am all for block and robocalls because all of us would like a quieter dinner hour. All right.
Well, can I ask a follow-up question based on what you were talking about, with something you said about Huawei? And on some levels, this is starting to look like a negotiating strategy, right? And do you think that that would have implications long-term for the U.S. in terms of its ability to take the high road on these issues, if in fact this is something that's traded away as part of a trade negotiation?
Yes. And in the interest of getting to lunch at noon, I'm just going to leave it at that.
Okay,
All
thank
right.
you.
Thanks.